Okay, are we ready? Yeah, we'll start. Okay, so I've talked now about the early Marx and the discussion of alienation, and I'd like to move now to the mature Marx, and in particular to the position which was the basis of the general development of Marxism after that. Now, you remember what seems to me to be really important is that this sentence that Marx writes in the German Ideology very early, when he says, for us, there's only one science, the science of history. And that assumption is one that continues. He's extremely keen on the idea that so to say there's only one science is not to say that you can't, as it were, abstract certain areas and discuss them by themselves. But in abstracting certain areas and discussing them in themselves, you are abstracting them from their actual bigger context. So you can talk about the economy if you want for Marx. That's a perfectly legitimate object of abstract consideration. But you can't talk about the economy as a completely free, self-standing entity. It certainly is not a sphere which is governed by absolute laws. Rather, it's an abstraction that people might make for particular purposes from what is the larger and fuller form of knowledge, which is history. And that is an idea that he retains during this period. And so if you want to think about history, how should you think about history? And now Marx has a view that if you want to understand history, what you have to understand is history as a succession of socio-economic formations. So the central way of understanding history is understanding that history is a sequence of relatively well-defined epochs, each epoch being called a socio-economic formation. And now furthermore, you can say something about the internal structure of such a socio-economic formation. And Marx introduces this really central distinction for him, in which he says a socio-economic formation is defined by the dominance of one particular form of the configuration of forces and means of production. So there are two thoughts in this. The first thought is you analyze a given society in terms of the forces of production available to that society and the relations of production available to that society. Now, the forces of production available to any society are the objective material and immaterial things which are used to produce. The forces of production are the forces that actually allow you to produce material life. So in the first instance, plows, hoes, water wheels, forms of hydroelectric energy, boilers, they are forces of production. They're things that are materially connected with the reproduction of material life. So you have a hoe, and the hoe actually helps you physically to generate more corn for consumption. Now, as I said before, these forces of production need not exclusively be material objects. At a first approximation, it's best to think about them as material objects. The cobbler has his hammer, that's a force of production. The society has a hydroelectric dam, that's a force of production. But there are some other things which are not material in that sense, which are also forces of production, such as skills, for example. So the cobbler doesn't produce simply by virtue of having a hammer, but the cobbler produces by virtue of having a hammer and actually knowing how to use the hammer in order to produce something. So skills what Marx sometimes calls general forms of intelligence, can be forces of production when you know how to analyze the pressure of a gas. You've acquired a force of production. You've acquired an ability to do something that you didn't have before you knew that. So there are, on the one hand, forces of production. In some societies, you have cobblers with hammers. In other societies, you have factories. Then he says, but the second component is not just the forces of production, but what he sometimes calls them the material forces of production. So forces of production or material forces of production. But note, when he says material forces of production, the material, as it were, modifies production. It doesn't modify force, right? So to say a material force of production is not to say a thing which is material and contributes to production, but it's a thing which contributes to material production. The material, there's a big mistake that people make at the beginning, in which, because Marx, of course, often describes his position as materialist, and so they say, okay, the material forces of production are the things that are central, and the material there means forces of production. So it's the material objects that are central, and the skills are somehow derivative. Because look, he says material forces of production, but the material isn't an ontological term referring to the nature of the object in question, so that a hammer is something material, but a skill is something not material. That's not the way it is. It's both a hammer and a skill are part of the material forces of production because they are things that actually contribute to materially producing corn and butter and wine and all the other necessities of life. So don't make the mistake of understanding Marx's materialism as what he calls an old-style materialism. Marx says in a number of places there was an old-style materialism, and the old-style materialism is the materialism of the Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment, and of Lucretius and of the ancient atomists. And the old materialism was an ontological thesis. It said only atoms exist in a void. That's really what the world is. Everything else is an epiphenomenon. As you know, Marx wrote his dissertation on ancient atomism. I mean, Marx wrote a doctoral dissertation. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on a very highly specific topic in the history of Greek philosophy, and it was a dissertation about the origins of atomistic thinking in the ancient world. So he knows about ancient atomism, and what he says is, my materialism is a new form of materialism. It's not the old form of materialism. It's not a materialism that emphasizes the ontological constitution of the world and the world being made of atoms, and then a claim that the spirit is derivative on that. Okay, so there are these material forces of production, which are the things people actually use to make their living, to eat, to drink, to get around. Then he says, if you really want to understand any society, however, you must see that these instruments of production, these material forces of production, don't just activate themselves. A hammer doesn't just use itself to hammer the nails in to the shoe. These forces of production are forces of production only in relation to people. So what he calls the social relations of production designate the relations of control between these forces of material production and various human beings. So, for instance, am I a peasant proprietor in the Middle Ages who has an alloidal farm? An alloidal farm is a farm that's free of feudal obligations and is inherited in a particular kind of way. It's just a feudal term. So here I am. I'm living in some place in the Schwarzwald, right? And I've got my alloidal farm. I've got my farm that's not subject to any kind of feudal things. And now Marx says, okay, well look, that farmer has effective relations of control over certain forces of production. That is, he has some kind of tendency and ownership of the land. The land is a material force of production because the land is something which is needed to produce the crops. He has some kind of ownership over the plow and the horse. So he stands in a certain relation to that plow and to those forces of production. Now compare that with a tenant farmer on someone else's latifundium, on someone else's large estate, who does not actually own the objects which he or she is using to produce. Rather, those objects are owned by the master. So the model is you've got these forces stand in a relation to different kinds of people, and the crucial thing is, what's the relation of control that exists between the people involved and the forces of production involved? And the particular configuration of relations of ownership or control that exist between the people and the forces are what's called the relations of production. So if you have a society that's composed of independent peasant farmers, suppose you had that, that would be one kind of social formation, a socioeconomical formation, because there'd be a certain kind of hoe and a certain kind of harrow and a certain kind of plow that was used there, and there'd be a certain relation between the people and those objects. Namely, every peasant on his farm sat there and owned his harrow or owned his plow. That's a particular relation. Then you might have another social formation, which was, for example, a primitive communal form of agriculture in which you had, for example, a group, a community, a zadruga, they say, a zadruga, a peasant commune, and the peasant commune owned the harrow, because a harrow is a big instrument that you need an investment for, and maybe an individual farmer can't afford a harrow. So the individual farmer might sit on his farm and have a hoe and have maybe a hammer, but he wouldn't have these big things that were only used once a year, like a threshing machine or a harrow, etc. They'd be owned by the zadruga. They'd be owned by the central peasant community, and the central peasant community would, as it were, lend it out cyclically at harvest time to the peasants. That would be a different formation because the relation of the people to the objects in that was different from the relation of the people to the objects in the latter case. So what Marx says is, if you want to understand what any society is, look at what kind of forces of production there are there, and look at what kind of relations of control exist between the people and the forces of production. Now, note, this can include control over people. That is, I say control over forces of production, but remember, in some circumstances, a person can be a force of production. So in ancient slave societies, if I am the Roman general Lucullus, I have control over gangs of slaves. That is, I can crucify them at will. They have no rights vis-a-vis me. I control what they do. I have overseers that whip them until they do it, and they plow the land for me. So that's a situation in which I've got, so in the medieval peasant case, you've got the peasants and they've got their hoes and they've got their hammers. In the ancient case, you've got Lucullus, you've got some free tenants perhaps, but you've also got slaves, and the slaves themselves are, as it were, like beasts of burden. They're like the horses. So in the Middle Ages, the peasant might own an ox and control the ox and use the ox to cultivate the land. In a slave society, you might own you might own the slaves and use the slaves to cultivate the land, right? So to understand a society, understand the forces of production and the relations of production. Now, second, Marx also thinks that understanding that is a good beginning, but it's not enough, because there are different possible relations between the forces of production and the relations of production. There are different possible ways in which those two things can be related to each other. And if you look over time, you can see that there are two kinds of relations that can exist that seem to recur in the way in which the forces of production and the relations of production are related to each other. There are two different kinds of relations that occur there. Namely, sometimes you can see that the particular social structure, the particular way in which the factors of production or the forces of production are distributed and owned, sometimes you can see that that is really efficient. That's the best way to use these forces of production. So sometimes there's what he will say, using this Hegelian dialectical terminology, there's a kind of coherence or consistency between the relations of production and the forces of production. That is, if you have a small peasant society and you don't have any machinery and trade is not very well developed, and you have the peasants mostly making their tools themselves, then it makes sense to say the individual peasant makes his hammer and owns his hammer and uses the hammer, and that's a reasonable thing. Now suddenly, if you have a development in the agricultural techniques so that the peasants are no longer just using hoes and hammers, but there are really complicated, hugely expensive mechanical devices that they use. So suddenly, instead of the peasant pulling his tomatoes, you have grain threshers that cost 300,000 pounds and are used only once a year. Then a form of organization which doesn't allow the peasants to pool their resources and have some kind of joint ownership over these big things isn't the most efficient way to do things. So there are relations between the forces of production and the relations of production that are harmonious. That is, the relations of production are the kinds of things which allow the forces to be deployed efficiently. Now, remember too, there's another part behind this, which is there's also a teleological direction to this. That is, the teleology behind this is that, as it were, the forces of production have a tendency to grow and expand. That, as it were, it isn't just the model is not, like all Hegelian models, it's not steady state. The model is a historical model. To say it's a historical model is to say things are always changing. But they're not changing at random. They're changing in a certain direction. And what Marx thinks is the natural, of course you can have wars, you can have various things that disrupt this, but the natural tendency is a tendency for the forces of production to expand. The peasant makes a better hammer. They invent the steam engine. There's a tendency for these forces to expand. And then you can think of you can think then of each particular epoch, which is a conjunction of a set of forces of production and a set of relations of production. You can think of that as directed toward, you can think of it teleologically as directed toward maximization of utilization of those forces. So you've got relations of production, you've got forces of production, and the forces of production are moving and have an internal, the kind of Spinozist view, have a kind of internal conatus moving in the direction of expanding. Now, the relations of production might be harmonious with that. That is, the relations of production might allow the forces of production to expand. And then you have a period of relative stability and harmony. However, now comes another crucial difference. Marx thinks that there's no set of relations of production that have the property that they have an ability to allow infinite growth of the forces of production. So this is really contrary to the idea that you find in economics, that if you have a free mark at if you have an appropriately neoliberal system, that neoliberal system of relations of production is compatible with an infinite increase in the productive powers. So Marx denies that. It's not the case that you can find some set of relations of production, or at least historically it hasn't been the case that any form of relations of production was infinite in its capacity. None of them was compatible with infinite growth. So after a period in which the relations of production are compatible with, or in fact even foster the maximal deployment and development of the the forces of production, after a period in which this is a harmonious relation, the distribution of the instruments of production allows them to be used in the most efficient way. At a certain point, the development of the forces of production will come up against a limit, and that limit will be a limit that's imposed by the relations of production. That is, you can't develop further and more efficient and more productive ways of reproducing your material life, and the reason you can't do that is because of demands that are put by basically the ownership relations in the society. That is the relations of production. I can't deploy the new technology because the new technology is patented by a corporation, and I must pay the corporation what they take to be an appropriate rate of profit for me to get this. So although if I had this new technology I could produce much more, there's a limit to the extent to which I can produce more, and that limit is a limit that's imposed by, not by the forces of production themselves, but by the relations of production. Here I am, the peasant. I could use this new, suppose one of these chemical companies develops a new seed of some kind, right? And now suppose it isn't just a way of them trying to get control of the world, which is the truth, but suppose it, now if I had that seed, I could actually be more productive. But I can't have that seed, and the reason I can't have that seed, that is I can't be more productive, the reason I can't do that is not because of something having to do with an inherent limit to my mechanical abilities, but something having to do with the distribution of control over resources in the society. Namely, that I can only get that seed if I pay this chemical company an exorbitant fee for this, because they own the patent of it. So that's the model. So history, Marx says, is a succession of stages in which there's a kind of rough harmony between the relations of production and the forces of production. That harmony is a harmony which allows the maximal development of the forces of production, and situations in which the development of the forces of production outruns the possibility of their actual productive employment, and it outruns the possibility of that productive employment because the relations of production, that is the control and ownership conditions, limited in one way or another. So history is a succession of these phases. Now, note, as I said, this is the first approximation, and as a second approximation, Marx says, if you actually think about historical society, so he says, there are slave societies, there are feudal societies, there are capitalist societies. A slave society is a society in which there are certain forces of production. Human beings are forces of production, and there are certain relations. And that means that the masters control the slaves. The slaves have no power, the slaves have no rights, have no legal standing, and they're used as relations of production. Feudal society, you have peasants on their proprietary land who are subject to feudal dues and have their objects of production conditional upon satisfying the feudal dues. capitalist society, you have no feudal dues, you have a landless proletariat who has nothing to sell except its labor power, and you have owners of machines and industrial plants who employ them, and they are different things. Now, of course, Marx wasn't stupid, and he didn't think that you, as it were, found pure slave societies. That is, this is a model for understanding history, but he didn't think that everyone in the ancient world was a slave or a master. There were, of course, even in the Roman Republic, there were slaves, there were some independent farmers still, there were all sorts of quasi-feudal relations between things. So an actual society will be a kind of teppich, a kind of carpet containing a number of different ways in which the relations and the forces of production are organized. So in the ancient world, there will be slaves, there'll be free people, there'll be freeholders, there'll be tenant farmers, there'll be a lot of different sorts of things. However, Marx says, you can describe each of these epochs relative to the form of production that's dominant in that age. So he'll say about the ancient world, for example, it was a slave-holding society. Now, that doesn't mean every particular worker in the ancient world was a slave. It doesn't mean that. It means there, of course, were some free landholders, but somehow the form of economic organization, which is slavery, was the dominant form in that configuration. And similarly, of course, in a capitalist society in the 19th century, you still have the occasional farmer who is living a pre-capitalist life. You know, maybe someone in the Schwarzwald there has, some happy peasant in the Schwarzwald sitting up there in St. Blasien in the Schwarzwald, yodeling and milking his cows, and so that exists. But as it were, the dominant form of organization in the 19th century is capitalism. Okay, so that's the relation. Now, then Marx says, having said this, you have to understand the structure of society as composed, therefore, of a series of classes. And now it's really important to see that, well, two things. One is Marx does not define class. As you know, he breaks off the analysis of Capital. There were supposed to be 3 volumes of Capital. He published the first volume. He didn't publish the second. He didn't publish the third. And he breaks off the manuscript just at the point at which he was going to define what a class was. So there isn't any archetypical text there which talks about a class. However, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be condescending to you, but it's important to see that class for Marx is not identical with the modern use of the term class, right? The modern use of the term class has to do with a certain kind of sociological sense of belonging to certain privileged or non-privileged groups. It's connected to forms of self-identification. It's connected to various sorts of things. For Marx, class is supposed to be defined relatively objectively. It's not defined by virtue. It's not a status term. That's what I'm trying to say. It's not a status term. It's not a self-ascribed or other-ascribed status term. It's an objective term. And what he says is a class is a group composed of all of those people who have the same relation to the means of production. Now, whether they know it or not, and whether they think about it or not. So slaves are a class in that they're a group of people, all of whom have the same relation to this socioeconomic structure. That is, they're all people who own nothing and can own nothing. And if you own nothing and you can own nothing, you're a slave. A slaveholder is a person who owns. Slaveholders are the class of those people who own such entities, objects, or as Aristotle says, a slave is a a speaking thing. Or in the 19th century, you remember the proletariat, not by virtue of identifying with anything, but by virtue of being a person who has a certain objective situation in the process of production, namely being a person who has nothing to sell but their own labor, right? So the proletariat is defined as all those people who do not have independent control over sufficient means of production to reproduce themselves. So they're not like small peasants who, if necessary, so small peasants might work, but they don't have to work because they have sufficient resources, at least minimally, to survive. And so a small peasant is not a member of the proletariat. A member of the proletariat is someone who doesn't have a farm which is sufficient to supply their own minimal everyday needs. But the proletariat is a person who is the set of all those people who can only survive by selling their labor power. Their labor power is all they have to give. Now that means, of course, there will be small peasants who will be increasingly proletarianized, right? That is, there'll be small peasants who have their little piece of green and grow their tomatoes and are not quite self-sufficient, but have to work. But from the fact that there are no sharp boundaries between these two things, it doesn't mean that it's not. They're not importantly different. And of course, this is terribly important for Marx's analysis of the origin of capitalism, because Marx thinks that capitalism gets started only when you have what he calls a violent expropriation of the peasants, right? The peasants have the property that they live on the land, and they have some kind of control over enough resources to maintain themselves in subsistence. So the peasant might be poor, might even be almost starving, but he's got some resources. Now, it's complicated what the nature of those resources are. Is it a peasant who's under a feudal regime? That means he has these resources, he has a traditional right to stay on them, but he's subject to duties, and he's subject to duties vis-a-vis the feudal lord. Or is it a free peasant who's not in a feudal system, who in some sense owns the land? So there are complications there. But basically the subsistence peasant is not the worker. And it's important, and that's important too, because the peasant who has a subsistence, the possibility of subsistence, is not exploitable for incipient capitalism, according to Marx, in the way in which workers are, right? That is, you can't put the wages of the peasant in the factory down too low, because if you put them down too low, the peasant always has the ability to decide just to live on his farm. So if you've got a peasant with a farm, even if the farm is just minimally able to sustain him, he isn't going to be willing to take any kind of wages in the factory. Why should he take starvation wages in the factory when he can stay at home and till his land and still stay poor? So it's really important that the origin of capitalism is getting the peasants off the land. You've got to, and that's why Marx is very interested, of course, in the whole enclosure movement at the beginning of the early modern period in Britain. You have these feudal tendencies. The owners of the feudal, the lords of the feudal manors throw the peasants off and close the land. And that's really important, because instead then of these peasants, who in principle have an opportunity to do something different than work in the factories, you have large numbers of people who have no land, and they have nothing, they have no support. They have to take whatever wages are offered. They have no alternative. So that's really important for this thing. And Marx emphasizes, the whole last part of Capital is a long description of the violent expropriation of the peasantry. The violent expropriation of the peasantry generates the proletariat, because the proletariat is people who have no control of economic resources. Not even the tomato patch in the back and a couple of acres with a cow. If they had that, they'd have an alternative to work. They'd be in a bargaining position, right? The proletariat has to be not in a bargaining position. If you've got peasants who have these plots, they can hold out for a while and strike. Maybe they can't live forever, but they can hold out for a couple of months eating tomatoes and courgette. Or whatever, potatoes and rice. And so therefore, so as Marx says, capitalism depends on the existence of a proletariat, and as he says, the proletariat is the group of people who are free, namely free of feudal obligations, but also free of feudal rights, and free of control over any forces of production that would be sufficient to allow them to maintain themselves in existence apart from their labor power. So, and so that's the other side of the freedom of contract that he talks about. So the members of the proletariat are, one, they're not under feudal obligations. Because they're not under feudal obligations, they can make any contract they want, right? So the freedom from feudal obligations is at the same time freedom of contract. They don't have to work for the lord of the manor 2 days a week. They're free to make whatever arrangements they want. But they're free to make whatever arrangements they want under the conditions that all of their land has been taken away from them, and they have no alternative to survival but to take the conditions that they can agree on with the thing. So there are two sides with the employer. So there are two sides of this concept. Okay. And so a class is this group of people who have the same status, the same situation, the same location in the process of production, the same relation to the forces of production, whether they know it or not. And sometimes, of course, Marx says that what's important is to turn a class in itself into a class for itself. That is, sometimes he says the proletariat are the people who are in this position, and what one must do is one must make them aware of the fact that they are in this position and they constitute a class by themselves. So they can constitute a class without knowing it, and knowing it can be an extra element in constituting them as a class in and of itself, and that might be a political demand. Okay, now, there are a couple of misunderstandings here now I want to talk about. So remember that when Marx talks about private, there are two misunderstandings that it's important to avoid. One is the misunderstanding that Marx is in some sense against private property, because the term private property is, for him, ambiguous. And it's important to see that there's a big ideological disagreement here. That is, liberals tend to assume that private property must mean one thing, and it's important for Marx that it can mean two different kinds of things. And so only if you understand why it can mean two different things will you understand what's going on. So when Marx talks about private property and the abolition of private property, he does not mean the abolition of individuals owning objects which they use. So any object which I use is not... So he has no objection to people having control of, that is, owning, any object that they actually use themselves. So when he talks about the abolition of private property, he doesn't mean that people will come in and take my toothbrush away from me, or take my word processor away from me, or take my desk away from me. These are immediate objects which I use for doing various sorts of things. When he talks about private property, he means specifically private property in the private ownership of the means of production which can be used to extract surplus value. So private ownership, so for him, the idea for liberalism, but liberalism mushes this distinction together. So for liberalism, there's only one notion of private property, and that is, I've got my toothbrush, and my toothbrush is mine. And then I've got my bicycle, and my bicycle is mine. And then I've got my house, and my house is mine. And then I have my factory, if I had one, and my factory is mine. And now Marx would say, that is an ideological construction. The relation of an individual to an object that he or she uses immediately, and the legal relation of control that I have over an industrial plant, where that industrial plant employs other people to work under conditions in which surplus value is extracted from them and comes to me. They're two different things. There's a gap between the two of them. Just as, I mean, as you know, nowadays, there's just been this horrendous decision by the US Supreme Court, as you know, that freedom of speech means there's no limits to the amount of money that large corporations can spend on political advertising. So the right of free speech moves immediately from the individual to the corporation. So the Constitution of the United States says individuals have the right of free speech. So I'm supposed to be able to say what I want. That's now interpreted as meaning General Motors can buy as many politicians as it wants. It can spend, General Motors as a corporation has the same rights as an individual person. And those rights include free speech. And since General Motors has the same rights to free speech that I do, just as I can take out an advertisement in the newspaper saying, I don't like so-and-so, there's no limits to the amount of money that General Motors can now spend in influencing the political process. So this is a characteristic move on the part of a particular ideology of liberalism. You start with the individual, and you start with certain relations of the individual which seem to have a kind of, I mean, I'm going to speak in a strange way, they seem to be sort of sacred, you know. I mean, nobody wants to have their toothbrush taken away from them, or their book that they've written things down on, and nobody wants not to be able to say anything. So there's a kind of intuitive plausibility to these basic things taken with relation to individuals. And then you move up through an ideological construction, and you construe large corporations who, by no stretch of the imagination, are persons in the sense in which an individual person is a person, and you extend the same thing to that. So Marx would say, when he talks about abolition of private property, he doesn't mean abolition of anyone owning anything. He means abolition of the ability of people to own productive plants, where those productive plants have the property that the people working in the productive plants are not the people who own them. So if I own a complicated productive plant, but I run it myself, suppose I'm some kind of, suppose I'm a painter of some kind, and I've got a big productive plant, and I've got all sorts of things in it, but I'm in there, and I work there. Maybe I even work there with my friends, and we do something. That's not private property in the appropriate sense. It's only private property if there's a discrepancy between the person who owns the thing, the people who actually run the thing, and if the thing is run in such a way that those people are, that surplus value is extracted from those people, which is attributed to the people who have the ownership rights over them. So that's the objection to private property in that sense. Now, there's an argument that you'll find in the analytical literature. It goes back to this man, Robert Nozick, against, which is supposed to be an argument against socialism, which goes like this. Nozick says, imagine a situation in which you have a football player, and the football player is really good. He's better than any other football player. He's Freddie Winston. What's his name? Freddie Flintoff. He's Freddie Flintoff. Freddie Flintoff. He's a big football player. Okay, he's really good. Suppose he's better than any other football players. Why are you smiling at that? I mean, you don't know what's funny about that, which is that my sister-in-law has a cat who's named after Freddie Flintoff. Anyways, so you've got this person, and now Nozick says, suppose you had a society which was completely egalitarian, egalitarian in the sense that everyone had the same income. And now suppose Freddie Flintoff says, I'm only going to play football if those of you who come to see me give me an extra £1 every time you see me play. And now Nozick says, well, at the end of the year, Freddie Flintoff, we would have an egalitarian society at the beginning. Everybody has more or less the same income, same resources. And at the end, Freddie Flintoff would have all of this extra money. And now Nozick says, and what is wrong with that? What exactly is wrong with that? And then he says, you can see that this Marxian system of equality and abolition of private ownership of the means of production, he says you can see that this Marxist idea of equality, therefore, can only be maintained if you have very strong coercive measures in place. Because you'd have to coerce people not to go and see Freddie Flintoff, or you'd have to coerce him not to do that. So he says, this system is only able to maintain itself if it prohibits capitalist acts between consenting adults. And the capitalist act between consenting adults is my giving an extra £1 to Freddie Flintoff so that I can look at him play. And that is his refutation of this structure. Now, this misses the point completely. This isn't right or wrong. This is just completely irrelevant, because for Marx, this is a discussion of what takes place in the realm of exchange. This is a discussion of what happens when we've got credit units and we exchange credit units for various sorts of things. For Marx, that realm is not the relevant realm for thinking about things at all. The relevant way to think about things is looking at the realm of production. Where does the productive powers come from? Who owns the productive powers? So note, for Marx, it's no objection. Marx, as I said, is not an egalitarian. He doesn't care whether you have more money than I do, right? Because the crucial thing about a society is not where in the realm of exchange the money is accumulated. It's who has control over the production process of the money. So now when he says a capitalist, sort of a socialist society would have to forbid capitalist acts between consenting adults, first, the exchange of money is not a capitalist act, right? The exchange, if I give you money for whatever reason, see, Marx doesn't, to describe my giving you money as a capitalist act is already an ideological perversion of what's going on. Because my giving you money has nothing to do with capitalism or anything else. Capitalism has to do with who owns the basic means of production and what are the relations between the people who own the basic factors of production. As long as you don't talk about that, you're not talking about capitalism or socialism at all. You're just talking about something completely different. Of course, in any society, my mother might give me an extra 10 pounds for my birthday, right? And, you know, as it were, people who proposed these new models weren't stupid. They didn't think that somehow people weren't going to be giving one another money for various sorts of things, provided money existed, or they weren't going to be giving one another things. So this idea that that this is a refutation is completely wrong. Second, remember that if Marx is correct, it isn't just the case. If Marx is correct, you wouldn't have to prohibit capitalist acts. Now, giving money isn't a capital. So again, this is another instance of the ideological attempt on the part of certain kinds of liberal thought to construe everything on an individualist basis, right? So ownership is I own my toothbrush. Free speech is I can speak freely. And the crucial thing is I have my money. To whom do I give my money? That's the crucial thing. But of course that's irrelevant because for Marx, you begin to discuss something as a capitalist form of organization only if there is a class structure. So capitalism is not definable on the basis of any kind of individual transaction. You can't look at an individual transaction and see whether the individual transaction, you can't read off from any kind of individual transaction whether that transaction is a capitalist transaction or not. The idea of a capitalist act, as if you could talk about what a capitalist act was in abstraction from the whole social structure, makes no sense. It's a capitalist act only if it's an act in a certain society, and it's an act in a certain society only if that society contains a group of people of a certain kind. So it becomes a capitalist act only if you've got members of the proletariat, and the proletariat is a group that's defined by its absence of control over other things which would allow it to reproduce itself, and therefore the necessity to sell its labor. As long as you don't have so the crucial thing for Marx is, do you or don't you have a proletariat? And that's a structural feature about the society. You can't get to that structural feature by looking at any individual transaction that will take place between people. And again, remember, so Marx would say, in a society which wasn't dominated by the capitalist form of economic production, you wouldn't have to forbid people from entering into contracts, right? So Marx in general is against freedom of the contract as the central thought, but he's also against this view that Nozick tries to say, which is that a socialist society would have to forbid free contracts, because his view, which might be wrong, of course, might be wrong, but his view is, no, you wouldn't have to forbid free contracts. In a society with no proletariat, you could have any free contract you wanted. What's wrong with a capitalist society is not that it's got contracts, but it's got contracts between proletarians and people who own capital. And a contract between a member of the proletariat and a member of an owner of capital is not a contract of the same kind as a contract that I might. So I might make a contract to you saying, suppose you play the piano really well, and I might make a contract with you in which I say, you come and play the piano for me, and I'll give you 10 pounds. Nothing wrong with that. That's a different kind of enterprise from an enterprise of a person who is in the situation that Marx thinks the proletariat is in, because you have independent ways of living. You can decide freely whether you want to take 10 pounds and come and play the piano for me or not. You've got alternatives. So yes, you can decide to do it or you cannot decide to do it. The crucial thing for Marx is the proletariat is not in that situation. The proletariat is not in the situation in which they can take it or leave it. So I can offer to give you 10 pounds to come and play music for me. And you can take it or you can leave it. And and you will leave it until I put the price high enough for it to make you worth your while. If I offered you £1, you probably wouldn't come. If I offered you £2,000, you probably would come. Or maybe you'd come anyway for other reasons. You might be friendly or whatever. But in any case, you'd have a choice. The crucial thing for Marx is that capitalism is defined by the existence of this group of people who are the proletariat, and they have no alternative but to sell their labor force, to sell their labor or starve. Now, you will say they do have a choice because they'll have different employers that they can go to. But Marx is of the opinion that one of the few laws of economics you can talk about is that the conditions offered by all the alternative people will not really be any different, that wages will in general fluctuate in a very, very tiny band. So it's true that I can go and work at US Steel, or I can go and work at Bethlehem Steel. So I've got a choice there, but it's a choice which is not a choice at all, because if the economy is actually working, the wages at both of those places will not be interestingly different. So it's a choice. It looks like a choice, but it's not a choice. So that's really important about this. Okay, so under conditions in which no one was a member of the proletariat, you wouldn't. So if no one is a member of the proletariat, you don't have to forbid capitalist acts, because if you've all got your garden plots at home, and you can, in principle, survive on tomatoes for a bit, if that's the way, then you won't take starvation wages from me. Why would you do that rather than eat your tomatoes at home? So you don't have to prohibit it. That's why he keeps saying, right? Remember, his model, he contrasts this with the anarchist model. His model is withering away, the withering away of things, not so much the abolition. So his model is, this form of contract will just wither away. It isn't that we have to prohibit it. It's just that if anyone offers this contract, you won't have any takers. Because why would you take why would you go and work in the steel mill for nothing if you could sit at home and cultivate your tomatoes? And it's only because you don't have that alternative, because you don't have any tomatoes at home, that you've got to do it. So you wouldn't have to prohibit it. It would just wither away because no one would do it anymore. Because people aren't stupid. They don't voluntarily go and work for starvation wages if they have any reasonable alternative. So this argument, this Nozick argument is really good because it shows you a deep structure of ideological. So for Marx, it's always history is first, and look at the whole. Don't look at the individual action. And for this kind of liberalism, it's always you start with the individual action, you try to build up from there. I'm sorry, I see the next person out there stomping in front of the door, so I've got to stop now. So tomorrow's the last one here at 12:30. I'll talk about surplus value, use value, exchange value, and related things. And then I'm free.